Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. Today I am finally updating my best champion Suicide Mastery compatible list. It's been a really long time. This is a long video coming, so I've got some important timestamps coming. So first off, I'm actually going to go over the masteries themselves. So if you want that, stick around. Otherwise, use the description to skip ahead to potentially the mathematical rundown and the actual logistics of running suicides and the pop min-max kind of understanding. Or if you want to just skip straight to the champion analysis and the tier list, there will be a description for that as well. So that said, let me jump in first because I know a lot of people here might be new or trying to understand whether or not what suicides are, whether or not they even want them. Suicide masteries are these two masteries in the offense tree on the far right over here. The first one is Liquid Courage. Liquid Courage, when maxed out, is 30% increased base attack for the cost of 0.6% poison damage per second forever. Now, it's important to note that 0.6% of your health per second also comes with a 30% reduced healing because that will come into play elsewhere. And the other one is Double Edge. This is 30% increased base attack, but at the cost of 20% of your health over the course of 16 seconds in the form of a bleed debuff. And you can see here where the first column is the amount of seconds, the second column is the amount of damage gain, and the third column is the amount of health you are losing in percentage. Generally speaking, if you're going to go for this, you're going to want to have it maxed, and we'll get into that later. And then the last real kicker on the Suicide Masteries is Recoil, where your champions increase attack during special attacks by 30%, but they sacrifice 5%. This actually has some scaling, but generally you only want 1 point in here, except for weird scenarios like a Legends run where you might cap this because you're only, say, running Ghost or Corvus Glaive and the fights are ending after a special 2 anyways. But that aside, I'm not going to go that deep into it. So those are the Suicide Masteries as far as damage, and you do need to be aware of the mitigation. So the mitigation portion is 3 points in recovery. This is going to give you 15% increased regeneration effects, as well as at least 1 point in willpower. We'll go over the math in a moment here. So for each new type of debuff on your champion, you will passively regenerate 0.5% of health per second. And you can see that you can actually max this out to go up to 0.7. But you can see that each point there doesn't offer you the same gains. There's kind of a diminishing return. Whereas with the actual damage suicides, it's 10%, bonus 10% each time you put a point in, so you want to have them maxed when you're using them. And then to note is Coagulate here. This gives percentage reduced bleed damage, and again has specific scenarios where you want it. You might not necessarily need it, and those are the Suicide Masteries. So at this point, I've gone over the Suicide Masteries, and let me go over the math itself. So I will stick a timestamp in the description below. So this is the math and the table, and I will break it down for you. It's really not as complicated as it looks. Let me jump to, let's try. Yeah, there we go. 150% works out. So these acronyms here are Max Liquid Courage, that's the poison debuff, Max Double Edge, and then Maxed Both. And this is considering the amount of percentage health you are losing per second while they are active, and down here these are the number of seconds you would live in those scenarios. And then over here I have Willpower 1 point, Willpower 3 points, Coagulate 1 point, Coagulate 2 points, Coagulate 3 points, and then 1 point in Coagulate, 1 point in Willpower, 3 points in Coagulate, 3 points in willpower. Now these are the percentages you're taking. This is also accounting for the recovery. This is all assuming you have recovery maxed, because honestly, if you're going to be running suicides, you need to have recovery maxed, and you need to have at least 1 point in willpower or Coagulate, if not both. But just for the sake of math reasons, I didn't put that here. But again, assuming you have recovery maxed, and in the case of Liquid Courage, this is accounting for the 30% reduced healing from the poison debuff. Now, this is the damage percentage you're losing per second, and this is kind of interesting to look at, but to be honest, it's not super helpful. Personally, I find these numbers way more helpful. So these are the number of seconds you would survive if that debuff was permanent. So Liquid Courage, the debuff is permanent, but Double Edge, right? So like when I say 80 seconds is how long you would survive, do bear in mind that the debuff itself is only 16 seconds long. So this doesn't actually translate to, oh, you would live 80 seconds in one fight. For as long as the debuff would be active, you would die after 80 seconds, or from a 16-second debuff, that's essentially 5 fights. After 5 fights of lasting at least 16 seconds with no other healing or damage taken, you would immediately die just to Double Edge. So when you say it like that, it doesn't sound as good, but this is where the numbers come into play, and this is why I really encourage you to get at least 1 point in willpower and maybe evaluate the options of more points as you need. But you'll see that the real like huge gain comes in one point. So with max Liquid Courage, and no points in willpower, you only have 166 seconds. This really isn't a lot of times. Even in shorter quests where you're pushing maybe 5 to 7 fights, you're really only looking at like 30 seconds a fight here, and it's not really comfortable. With 1 point in willpower, you have 506 seconds before it kills you. And this is a good amount of time, especially if you are nullifying it with some kind of regeneration or reduced poison damage. Many champions have that offering. 500 seconds is a healthy amount of time, or even if you're not and you're just using it and you're just eating the damage, a lot of champions have enough damage where 500 seconds, if you play well and you play perfect, you really don't need to have any more points invested in willpower. And at 3 points here, you do jump up to like way over 2,000 seconds, and at that point, you really don't need it. But again, willpower is a really expensive mastery, and I think personally the sweet spot here is the 1 point, and then when you're flooded with units, maybe you can consider it. But those masteries are also potentially better spent elsewhere. That said, moving on to max Double Edge here. Again, this is 80 seconds or roughly 5 fights. With 1 point in willpower, that goes up to 148 seconds. And that 60-second boost is a really big deal. 68-second boost translates to roughly 4 more fights or so, maybe 5 more fights before, the Double Edge alone kills you. So 9 fights, 9/10 fights is feeling pretty good. And even then, though, you really generally only want max Liquid Courage and 1 point in willpower. You want to kind of handle Double Edge with bleed immune champions. Or people who can shrug the debuffs, because Double Edge, this damage ticks so much faster. You can see here with the percentages like 1.25 to 0.6 or 0.67 to 0.19. You're losing health so much faster at the start of the fight that you really feel the pain of Double Edge. Whereas with poison, it translates so much slower that, even off of like a level, like a 40% or a 20% revive, you do get some time out of your champion to start. And then moving on to like 1 point in Coagulate, 1 point in Willpower, you see how you go up to 181. And you might say, well, with 3 points in Willpower, you go up to 224. But this is saving you 1 mastery point, as well as giving you that benefit of an additional point to Coagulate, which has a lot of niche uses for specific champions. The main one to name there is Omega Red. And then finally, the actual consideration, this is where like the numbers really come into play, because generally speaking, if you're running half Suicides, you run max Liquid Courage. You only run max Double Edge if you're running bleed immune champions. But if you're running both Suicides, which is what most people generally lean towards, you're gonna want to consider what you're gaining and losing in investing in these points. So going from no points in willpower to 1 point in willpower gives you an extra 41 seconds or so of time, almost doubling the amount of time you live when suffering from both debuffs. Again, this is under the assumption both debuffs are permanent. It will actually be longer in real effect because Double Edge is not a permanent debuff. And 3 points in willpower almost triples, not quite, maybe like 2.8 times your health here, survivability. And you can see here that maybe those 2 extra points aren't quite worth it. Just because, you really want to be mitigating these elsewhere, because 138 seconds with 3 points in willpower really isn't a lot of time. And even if you see here, if you take 3 points in Coagulate and 3 points in willpower, 287 seconds, you're really feeling hurt. Even just like half Suicides with 1 point in willpower, you're getting about double the amount of survivability. So that's the math and that's the rundown. So just like kind of TLDR, I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but I really think understanding the math and understanding what's happening when you take these potential gains in attack damage is understanding that, hey, if you're trying to run suicides and you're not taking any account for champions, you want to run half suicides. If you have a bleed immune team that doesn't need to worry about bleeds, go ahead and run max double edge. And if you want to run both, you absolutely need to be mitigating one, if not both, of the suicides, and that's not even accounting for recoil. So at this point, I'm going to talk about the champions themselves. So I will stick a timestamp in the description below, as well as zoom out of this a little bit here. Let's see if we can't find a sweet spot there. That's close enough. So here, I'm going to go through the champions one at a time, but first let me go through my key. So if the champion has a W, that means they heal with willpower. C means their immunity is conditional, as in it's not like a permanent immunity. So like Emma Frost is a great example where she's only immune when she's in diamond form, but that's enough to shrug the suicides at the start of the fight. B means they have a compelling reason to run both masteries. I don't give this to champions who are just immune to both. This is specifically for champions who strictly benefit from the suicides and don't necessarily suffer from them in any way, shape, or form, recoil included. A means they have additional benefits when they run suicides. Maybe they heal something, maybe they have power gain like Diablo. D means they are strictly better as a defender. Not to say that they're a bad attacker, just that their defense power is strictly better, because sometimes some of these champions are just beasts of defenders. R means they have some form of recoil mitigation. N means the recoil is completely nullified, and S means recoil penalized. Recoil penalized being like they want to spam a specific special, and that's going to cost you health very quickly. If they are green, that means I think they are a high value rank up champion. These are champions who might even be worth running without suicides. They are just absolutely great champions, and you'll see that there's a great many of them in this game. Yellow means I think they're conditionally worth ranking up. It kind of depends on your roster, what kind of content you're running, what you're using them for, but there are situations where they're worth ranking up, but also, you know, there's pros and cons to running suicides, and you need to kind of evaluate it. If you ever have any questions and you've got someone in the conditional and you're thinking about pulling that trigger, feel free to comment, tag me in it, and I will help you figure it out, piece it together. This is one of my favorite part of the games, is finding champions that work with suicides. If you have someone that's not on my list anywhere, feel free to call me out and let me know, or you feel like someone needs to be moved up or down, please let me know. I do what I can to update this when I can. It does take a long while, and I am happy to get more information, because you know what, I only have the information that I can get from playing, and then I do have a small list of honorable mentions, which I will go through eventually. So let me zoom out here. So bear with me. Let me drink some water. So that, my friends, is the overall list, and we're going to go through, starting here with Medusa. I'm going to go through all the poison champions that are worth talking about. If I don't mention them, that means they're just immune and that's it. There's no other context I need to give. Then I will go through the list of both. I will then go through bleed, and I'm just going from top left down, middle column down, top right down. So if you're trying to like fish for a specific champion explanation, just jump around. And if you're like, oh, he went Darkhawk and then skipped Voodoo, feel free to call me out. But that's my order. That's how I'm going. That's how I've got my notes structured. And we will start with Medusa. Sorry for rotating this through. So timestamp here. Sorry, that's a note I need for myself. So starting with the poison immune Medusa, has recoil mitigation. So Medusa is most commonly used for her armor shattered ability. It makes her kind of an anti-robot, and some people might say, oh, she's punished because she really wants to either go high aggressive and then SP1 to get armor shattered, or high aggressive SP2 to get armor shattered. But the truth is, you can play the fight a little bit slower and you can drop an SP3, but also like taking one recoil quantity from an SP1 or SP2 to proc armor shattered, and then building your way back up to SP3s and only SP3ing. It's really not that big of a deal, and she just does enough damage and has enough consistent output that that recoil damage can be mitigated just by using SP3 instead. And you can proc armor shattered off the SP3 very easily. It just takes a little bit longer. You won't get that ability as soon, but if you're in a situation where you're like, let's say, trying to push for an armor shattered and you're at like 7% health, you can get it off an SP3 and save yourself that extra 5% health. Next up, I have Hyperion here. Hyperion is, I put an S there. Now, he is tentatively green because he's green in the sense that if you want to run just poison, you can definitely get away with that. But I think that running both, even just having recoil active, this guy really gets punished because Hyperion really relies a lot on his special spam. You know, you ramp up special 3 and then special 1, special 2. Now, this is where it kind of gets tricky because in shorter fights, SP3 spamming with Hyperion, totally viable. The thing is that his SP1 applies Incinerate, plus the Despair Mastery is a really good anti-heal that people use. It's a good way to mitigate healing effects, and they rely on that Incinerate for persistent damage. And his SP2 applies the Armor Break and the Stun. A lot of people like to use Hyperion and then stun lock people in the corner, and you can't really do that when you have recoil active. It's doable, it just really hurts, and it's actually the reason my Hyperion's not ranked up. But, you know, that's there. I should also mention that there is a small way to mitigate some of the damage that you take by kind of like dropping an SP3, saving up your cosmic charges, and then you stepping back and healing. But it's really cumbersome to activate the healing for Hyperion and any kind of like the earlier / mid-game content. So generally speaking, if you're going to use him for suicides, he's still a high value rank up. Just be mindful of the amount of recoil damage you're going to take from SP1 and SP2s, but also potions exist in the game. And hey, I'm a huge fan of potions. Next up, I have Captain Marvel. So Captain Marvel I have listed as a strong value to run both, as well as recoil mitigation / nullification, as well as conditional immunity. So she wants to end fights in very short bursts. If you watch my channel, you know I love Captain Marvel. This damage is increased so much, and she actually even benefits from recoil because like a lot of her burst just comes from the SP2. It's just like pew, they're dead. And when you go binary and she's awakened, you have a small window of invulnerability. That small window of invulnerability means that you don't take any recoil damage at all. Additionally, I say conditional immunity because most likely if you're running Captain Marvel, you probably want to be running Nick Fury because she really benefits from that synergy. Almost needs it sometimes, but she really benefits from that synergy. And if you're running Nick Fury, you probably want to run Nick Fury x Deadpool synergies because with Captain Marvel, that's actually like a free 10 to 11.5% heal every single fight. And it's absolutely amazing for questing. It's so much sustainability. That she just benefits, you know, from having it. Additionally, when you go binary, you shrug all damage over time effects. You have to be over a certain number of binary ignition charges, but when you are above that amount, you do shrug off all damage over time effects. So let's say you start the fight at 25, like you start the fight binary, you don't even have a bleed buff at the start of the fight. So in that regard, she kind of has like this conditional immunity to both bleed and poison, even though she's just naturally immune to poison damage. Next up, I have Hulk Ragnarok. This man is one of the few champions who can really just handle degeneration debuffs. Face Me is an incredibly useful kit to have against that node and just absolutely worth ranking up. Not to mention this champion has just so much raw potential and damage, and his awakened ability allows him a coin flip chance to regenerate similar to like 30% of his health. And I mean, even like if you're questing, you proc that like 1 every 4 times, which it's supposed to be 50%, but let's say you proc that once every like 4 or 5 times, you're really mitigating the amount of damage you take from double edge. Just you be mindful that you are taking a lot of damage from double edge, but I would make the argument it's worth it. Additionally, a lot of times you will ramp this guy up to a special 2, and then just stun and, you know, hammer into them. And the kind of content you're bringing this guy to, they're probably dead by the end of a special 2, etc. So you don't have to worry about taking a lot of damage to recoil. I should mention that this guy does want to use special 1 for the heal block. So if you're using him for a heal block, be prepared to take a lot of damage there. But he is naturally poison immune. Next up, I have Red Hulk. This is one of those conditional rank ups. Red Hulk is automatically immune to poison. He's not immune to it so much as it's automatically removed upon gaining it. So the reason I say has additional benefits is because every time he gains a poison, he has a chance to convert it into a heat charge. He automatically shrugs it, so no poison damage, but could potentially gain higher damage numbers until he maxes out around 10, and just essentially ramp up his damage much faster. So that's kind of like a neat ability to like have the poison active. You get the damage for free, and you potentially start with some free damage. Next up, we have Mysterio. So Mysterio, I have heal listed as recoil mitigation, and that is because a lot of his damage comes from like building up to a special 3, and then using that to boost his poison damage. So generally speaking, you don't really use the special 1 or the special 2. Because the special 3 does not cause you to take damage from recoil, Mysterio is a great way to get around that. Just to be mindful, the reason he's actually here in the yellow is just the value of the champion overall. So you need to evaluate your roster. Next up, we have Mephisto. So Mephisto has just always been generally accepted as a better defender. I think that's still true. I think the champion's absolutely amazing as an attacker. He's got so much value in the nullify, etc. I just think he's still better as a defender. But taking it from an attacker standpoint, this champion is potentially really powerful for you in Alliance Quest. I just want to point out that he has potential for a lot of heals, a safety net, and really it's really important that he's poison immune, because that means he doesn't take that reduced healing. Just do be mindful that if you're running both Suicide Masteries, that the double edge is pinging your life off very quickly, so you'll eventually just force healed off of your persistent charges, even if you don't get pushed into it. But hey, that sustain is still really solid, and potentially what you need in Alliance Quest, as that's one of the things to consider when you're running Suicides. Next up, we have Diablo. Diablo here has conditional immunity. That conditional immunity is the fact that he takes 35% reduced poison damage, and that means you have 0.15% healing from 1 point in willpower. So like the reduced poison damage and then the overall healing comes out to that 0.015% healing. He additionally gains 20% power rate and 450 attack while poisoned. I believe he needs to be awakened for that. But my point is that while poisoned, you're strictly getting beneficial effects, and that can be a really good time if you have a high ranked Diablo. My brother actually pulled a 6-star Diablo, and he is loving it. He went half Suicides and says the champion is way stronger when you're not having to worry about bleed chipping your health away. Just do be mindful of, he has fairly reliant on his persistent charges, so you got to be careful there. Next up, we have Man-Thing. So Man-Thing, he wants to do a lot of special 1 spamming, special 2 spamming, and he wants to be very reliant on Mystic Dispersion, and so he is recoil penalized. And the issue with that is that because of a lot of his damage comes from his ability to rotate special 1s and special 2s, and put a lot of poisons on the opponent that way, you're taking a lot of damage from recoil. And if you opt to run both Suicides like I have, Man-Thing, you're not spamming special 1s, and then you really feel that power loss, that damage loss. But still speaking, he's just great as a defender. I think he's better as a defender than he is as an attacker, just because of his kind of interactions with crits. It makes him very frustrating. But hey, new champion, so if you have more comments, feel free to let me know. I'm always interested. And then just kind of a quick touch on here is Ronan. Ronan wants to stun lock people in the corner by spamming specials, and spamming specials doesn't work when you're trying to run Suicides. Sorry, lots of talking. Next up, we have Ghost. Ghost is an absolute powerhouse. If you pull Ghost, I beg you, please turn on Suicides. This champion has just absolutely breaks the game. When Ghost phases, she removes all damage over time effects and gives herself a Fury buff in return. And that Fury buff is huge, like absolutely monstrous. And if she is awakened and you have Suicides active, you start the fight with 2 Fury buffs, because she instantly phases, instantly converts both of the damage over times, and it's just such a good time. Additionally, she has additional benefits in the fact that she can get those Furies and mitigate recoil with the Red Hood synergy. If you are using the Red Hood synergy and you special 2, there's a way to time it where you phase and you don't take any damage from recoil. It's really not that hard. Just watch a few videos of the timing and you will get it, and it's just an absolutely good time. Ghost is so good with suicides. I absolutely encourage you to watch videos if you disagree, because I tell you, you will not disagree for long. Next up, we have Omega Red, another champion who just absolutely promotes these masteries. If you have an Awakened Omega Red, let me tell you how much of a game changer this is. So Omega Red heals with willpower. So essentially you run willpower and 1 point in coagulate, and that is because he has 90% reduced bleed damage. And so with 1 point in coagulate, that is 100% reduced bleed, but the bleed is still active. So he's poison immune with a 16-second bleed, and so you're healing off of the bleed there, but not taking any damage from it. Additionally, he has the fact that he gains death field, so his damage that comes from the bleed, from having that bleed active, it raises the amount of spores you can put on your opponent and really pushes the amount of damage you can get very early on. I think it's like a 30 or 40% boost in damage over time, like damage per second, and it's an absolute blast. You're going to want to run like Omega Red and Sabretooth and just blow through content with him. And having played him with and without suicides, let me tell you that the amount of time it takes to take champions down is significantly longer. Even if you're playing it right proper, just having that 16 seconds of like short burst, high damage window from Omega Red is a huge game changer. Additionally, just the amount of sustain you get from having a 16-second heal at the start of every single fight makes Omega Red so much more higher value, especially in things like Alliance Quest. Next up, we have Namor. Namor here is this new poster child. This guy is absolutely a monster. All 3 of these champions here in the beginning are just absolute monsters with suicide. So Namor conditionally heals with willpower. He needs to be high sig because what happens is when he's attacking the opponents, all of the damage he's taking from suicides is actually being reflected into the opponent, and you're still healing from the willpower. So there's a small window where you're kind of healing. So I say heals with willpower, but you're not really healing so much as mitigating most of the damage, because you can't exactly have perfect uptime with attacking into the opponent. And again, that's where I say the conditional immunity is, because you're really only not taking that damage when you're attacking into the opponent. Do be mindful that you can attack into the opponent's block, because all that matters is that Namor is physically doing an attack animation, not that he's actually hitting the opponent. And then he has recoil mitigation in the fact that whenever he uses a special, he does regenerate a small amount of health. And Namor wants to do a special 3 into a special 3 into a special 3 into a special 2, and then they should be dead. And in that situation, you really don't take any recoil damage. So it's a great time. And because he wants to do those high damage specials, having recoil active, having that boosted base attack rate is absolutely wonderful for him. Next up, we have Warlock. He's both, quad immunities there. Look him up. Absolute monster. If you have questions, I'm not the right person to ask because I don't have one, but he is just a robot, double immune. Guillotine 29, double immune. Iceman, double immune. But I do want to say that if you are trying to use Iceman to like counter evade champions, it's a lot of special 1 spamming, and that could potentially be recoil. But if you're not using him for that particular utility, you can get a lot of value out of that double immunity. He is triple immunity, I believe, but my point is you can get a lot of value out of the suicide immunity for him, and you don't need to be spamming special 1. You can just save up to a special 3 and use the fight that way. Next up is Emma Frost. Hers, like I said earlier, it's reliant on she starts in diamond form in every fight. So every fight you immediately shrug, poison, and bleed. Just do be mindful that you need to stay in diamond form in order to stay resistant to those, stay immune to those poison and bleed effects. So that's not a problem for the suicides, as once you've shrugged them, they're gone. You're not going to take them back. But do be mindful that if you're like trying to use her for biohazard, that she's not technically immune to those nodes. She's only immune when in crystal form. Next up, we have Aegon. Aegon's conditional immunity is the fact that at a combo of 5 or higher, he has a 40% chance to shrug off a debuff every time he crits, as Aegon I think it's at like 100 or something. At a higher number of combo 2, he moves it to a 100% chance to shrug off debuffs on hits. I'm actually going to take a quick moment to give this guy the thing he deserves, and that truth is that he deserves to be there. Aegon, if you're using Aegon, it's probably in longer content, Realm of Legends, Labyrinth of Legends, and the truth is that you really, really want Suicide's active because that boosted amount of damage makes a huge difference. Once you've got him ramped up, one hit in, and you're going to shrug both debuffs, and that increased damage is just absolutely, absolutely worth. You build up to a special 3 anyway, so there's a lot of recoil mitigation there. I should give him that as well. I apologize for adding this at the last second. And so, you know, there's just a lot to be said for Aegon. This guy is an absolute powerhouse for long content. And honestly, if you're, you know, lacking a lot of these other green options, but you have an awakened Aegon and you have the 6 stones to bring him up, or if you just love the champion, he could potentially be what you need, especially if you're willing to be patient and ramp him up at the start of every quest, because really that's the main frustration with Aegon. Next up, we have Clairvoyant. So Clairvoyant, she actually starts off immune to 1, and then she changes stances. She starts off immune to poison at the beginning of every fight, and then a 5-hit combo ending with a light attack changes her to being immune with bleed. I haven't gotten the chance to play test her, so I believe that's how it works. If I'm wrong, feel free to correct me. I apologize. And she shrugged both debuffs off very quickly, but the major thing here is the fact that she can only be immune to 1 type at a time. So you don't have to worry about taking Suicides back, but do be mindful that if you're trying to use her for her immunities, that you can't like use her for both at the same time, which comes up in situations like Biohazard particularly, or if you're trying to go down an alliance path, or if you're trying to use her for one of her utility options. That's the major one, and the reason she has R is because she has the potential to lifesteal just an absolutely crazy amount of health, and if you're doing that, that can really help, you know, mitigate the amount of damage you're taking from recoil. Be mindful that you still take recoil afterwards, but you know, if you're trying to stay near that 95% range, that can be a really good time. Next up, we have Darkhawk. So Darkhawk has a recoil mitigation here because whenever you switch between modes, you get a huge regeneration that essentially is equivalent to the amount of recoil damage you take. And so you lose the recoil damage at first, and then you gain the health back up right away, and so it's almost like you didn't take recoil. So that's kind of why I have recoil mitigation and recoil nullified, because the heal is big enough to kind of like completely mitigate it. But do be mindful that, let's say you're at 3% health and you use a special, you're gonna die first most likely, just kind of depending on the length of the special and how much health you have. It's very tricky. Don't use specials with Darkhawk sub 5%, because you're probably gonna die. Next up, I have Dr. Voodoo. Dr. Voodoo heals 12% of his health at the start of every fight, or 8.4% with poison over 10 seconds. This really helps mitigate suicides. I run him, being mindful that Dr. Voodoo does want to use his special 1 and special 2 a lot. That heal still makes a really, really big difference. And the fact that he just healing constantly really, really makes it so with willpower active and maybe like a point in coagulate, you don't feel it for the first 12 or so seconds of the fight, and by then hopefully you've put off enough damage, and in shorter fights it doesn't even matter, and in longer fights it's okay, you're using Dr. Voodoo for the sustain anyways. And honestly, you don't have to use the special 1 or special 2 from Dr. Voodoo if you feel like you'd rather save that health, and you can use that heal from him to kind of push sustain instead. Next up, I have Ronin. Ronin, his immunity is from stance dancing. You got to get really good with him. I have a lot of video content on how to play Ronin if you're interested. But essentially, you change into guard stance to drop a debuff. So like the fight starts and you go parry, 1 hit, shrug, debuff, dash back in, change a different stance, parry, 1 hit, shrug off a second debuff. If you like do it perfectly, you can get away with losing like 3 to 4% health with an aggressive AI. Just be mindful that sloppy play can really get the best of you, and additionally, you know, you can kind of tweak around with his specials and the way you want to use them to really mitigate that damage, but the Ronin issue is mostly just in utility and damage output. That's why a lot of people think he is lower than he deserves. I think this guy deserves more love, but I can't bring him up any higher without a 5-star version, as I seem to be lacking at the moment. Both visions here get their S because they both have like extreme power drain capabilities in their special 1 and their special 2, namely their special 2, but the special 1 is worth mentioning. But the fact that you take recoil every time you do that makes this not a good time. I still have a higher ranked vision just because I love the champion, and I just wait for a special 3 and mitigate the recoil damage that way. But again, you got to be aware of the potential better champions for this. But if you really need that power drain champion, he is a potential like 1 counter fight, 2 counter fight if you're trying to play him aggressive power drain. Next up is Sentinel. The big thing with Sentinel is just that Sentinel, when ramped up, wants to spam specials a lot because does have that reduced special cost. So you do take a lot of damage from recoil in that regard. But otherwise, Sentinel is a solid champion, immune to both naturally. Nebula, immune to both naturally. She is someone I think is just better as a defender. I think that if you put her on like a recovery node, she can be right proper frustrating. But I might have to change that as I see more and more content of these like insanely god level plays of people using Nebula, because she can be an absolute monster of an attacker if you are good enough with her. So that's where the conditional really comes into play, is like she is one of those like insanely high tier skill champions that you just need to be a god with in order to use and get the most value out of, but she's worth mentioning. And at the very least, even as a defender or even in weaker hands, she's still a great champion to play. Next up is Blade. His conditional immunity is the fact that 1, you're not immune to poison, and 2, the fact that you shrug bleeds faster when you have more power, but essentially at the start of every fight, you're going to have 0 power. So even if you play super aggressive, you're still going to lose like 8 to 11 seconds worth of health with Blade. But the reason he's worth as a conditional rank up is because of the Ghost Rider synergy, and he's just very, very good with Ghost Rider. And so you might want to rank him up for the danger sense, use him as a couple counter, and once awakened you can kind of mitigate some of the damage with that healing, but be mindful that you'll never get past 70 and you'll probably lose more health than you ever gain. But hey, there is a small amount of mitigation there, and he's worth mentioning, and he's just strong enough of a champion to stick this conditional list. Next up we have Mr. Sinister. So his anti-crit mechanic makes him strictly better for Alliance War defense. But I should mention that his special 1 transfers both Suicide Masteries over. So if you stick this guy on like an SP1 preferred node, and you have Suicide Masteries on, they jump in and he's going to special 1 and pass both of the damage over time effects over. And it's just an absolutely good time. I should mention you can defeat science champions to heal more from poison than you take. Just not a lot, and it's not very reliable, because how often are you going to have the opportunity to go like science with Mr. Sinister? And even then, by then you've probably taken too much damage from the suicides to justify. But hey, maybe you really like this champion and you want to try him out with suicides. And if you're not afraid to pop potions, it's a good time. Next up we have Dormammu. I know he's better as a defender, but I still don't have a bloody Dormammu, so I can't give you any more information. I apologize. It would all just be rough speculation, but he does have immunities protecting him there. There's a lot of potential. I think he's potentially worth staying up higher in the list, maybe even green worthy if I could just get one and play with him. An update here, I moved Ultron up into the conditional rank up here because Ultron has that kind of guaranteed heal, sub 50%, sub 25%, and when you're using him strictly for Alliance quests, that guaranteed heal can be incredibly beneficial. And I think it's worth mentioning. I accidentally skipped Invisible Woman. My apologies. When the Force Field is active, she actually heals from both suicides. This helps to mitigate, and that's kind of that conditional immunity that heals from willpower healing, because the bleed and the poison is actually also going to remove the shield and remove the healing effect you're getting. But it's a pretty good amount of mitigation, and once the bleed is gone in longer fights, you heal from the poison, and you can actually get like a soft amount of healing from it. Next up is Karnak. Karnak, once awakened, means he shrugs debuffs off faster, so you have a huge reduced duration on Double Edge, and you also take 65% reduced damage from poison, and with 1 point in willpower, you actually would end up healing. Again, I don't have an awakened Karnak at a high enough rank for me to judge, so he stays down here, but I've heard good things, so there's potential there. I'm just not there yet. Kreen Groot is already bleed immune, and he shrugs off debuffs at the cost of a Fury. Because he shrugs stuns as well, he's typically better as a defender. Crossbones, he when awakened has a small chance to shrug debuffs, and it's higher if he's up against Science. Do be mindful that because he has that ability to shrug debuffs, I do think he's generally better as a defender. I think King Groot, Crossbones, these are solid rank ups if you're trying to like run Suicides and run defenders that aren't negatively impacting your alliance, and potentially even benefit, because like King Groot and Crossbones, one of their issues is as defenders they don't hit hard. When you run Suicides, they hit a little bit harder if your opponent makes a mistake. Agent Venom has a chance to shrug off debuffs. That's that conditional immunity, and it's actually a pretty high rate. It happens fairly often when I use him in versus. So if you really like Agent Venom, maybe rank him up to rank 2. I probably wouldn't take it much farther. Kingpin, I'm still not sure if he shrugs debuffs off at the start of the fight to gain Furies, but there's a potential for value there. And then back into some interesting stuff here. So with the bleed immunes, we have Corvus Glaive. Corvus Glaive does not take damage from bleed, cold snap, or shock when he has glaive immunity. As a result, the debuffs appear, but he is actually healing from them with willpower. So as long as you don't get knocked down or run through all of your glaive charges in the first 16 seconds, which isn't going to happen, you are actually healing from bleed. And because poison damage is so little between poison and bleed and willpower, you're still actually regenerating health, just not a lot of it at the start of every fight. So because Corvus Glaive wants to end fights very quickly with like a small number of crits and a special 2, you actually want to run both plus that damage from recoil and end the fight quickly that way. Next up, we have Ghost Rider. Ghost Rider, his heavy attack gives you a wicked long amount lifesteal period. You got to learn how to play him. I think I have a guide. If I don't, I have one coming out soon enough. And that boosted damage as well allows you to heal. Sorry, let me rephrase that. He actually heals a flat amount of his health anyways. So essentially, you can mitigate the amount of damage you're taking from recoil, because Ghost Rider does want to cycle through his SP1 and his SP2. So you're going to take recoil damage. Excuse me, but the long lifesteal period, you can regenerate like 30 to, I think I've regenerated like 55% health in one rotation of a lifesteal, and it's an absolutely good time. Just do be mindful that when you're running both Suicides, that the poison does cause reduced healing, so you're not getting that much as well. But I do want to say that Ghost Rider is like one of the bigger flaws is that, it feels like you're hitting with a wet noodle sometimes. Suicides does shore that up a little bit, not enough, honestly, but it does help out in many situations. Next up, we have Iron Man Infinity War. He is bleed immune so long as you have armor. You always start every fight with 1 armor up, so you always shrug the bleed debuff at the start of every fight, so you really just have to worry about the poison. Next up, we have the Thing. The Thing is one of the best defenders in the game due to forcing specific mechanics from players, and you can comfortably spam special 3 with him and then hit a special 2 for some big damage. I do want to say with the Thing that you got to be mindful of the fact that if you're trying to use him with like the champion Hela, Heimdall, and Angela synergy, that running Suicides, at least running both Suicides, is really, really painful. And honestly, even just taking damage from recoil makes that like champion synergy roster hurt a lot more. Almost something you don't want to do, but hey, it's just something to be mindful because you will be trading off a lot of damage. And running both Suicides means you don't need to run that synergy in order to get good amounts of damage from him to begin with, as long as you're willing to ramp him up. Next up, we have Luke Cage, who is already bleed immune. I do want to say he is penalized by running Suicides because he typically wants to special 1 stun lock opponents into the corner. And when you're pressing special 1 a lot, you're going to be taking a lot of damage from recoil. And then Morningstar, bleed immune as well naturally. She has the potential to regenerate a lot, but taking that poison and that reduced regeneration, she's still a monster of a champion. This is where I have her just from like seeing content of her. I don't see a lot of content of people running her with both Suicides. My gut instinct is to say that she's just absolutely a really good utility powerhouse, and is probably worth worth ranking up and running with Suicides. I can't confirm though, so my apologies. If people have more information of running Suicides with Morningstar and you think that will affect where I place her on this tier list, let me know, because I think that information is important. Next up, we have Korg. Now, I have Korg in green not because I think he's a worth rank up as an attacker, but because he's such a pain in the ass as a defender that you should definitely rank him up. If you have a Korg and you're trying to run suicides, rank him up, because let me tell you, people, the amount of damage you're losing from having Korg with suicides as a defender isn't so much that it's going to drive people nuts when they're taking even more damage from him when they screw up. Again, Korg, like many champions, one of his issues is that he doesn't really deal a lot of damage, so even when people mess up, they can kind of recover. So having that increased damage on Korg can really punish players when they make a mistake, and I think it's actually worth the amount of damage he's taking from suicides, personally. And then we have champions that are not here for some reason. We have Colossus. Colossus just got reworked. I think that for now I have him as a conditional one, as the rework is coming out, but it's not quite out yet. I think he might get that green star. We're just waiting on confirmation, but he is naturally bleed immune, and we can confirm that later. Rogue has 65% reduced debuff duration, meaning that you will drop that bleed much faster, but this also applies to stuns, which makes her a potentially very good defender if you're fishing for one that's suicide friendly, and you can special one spam for free damage with recoil mitigation. It's just not optimal, as you generally would prefer to use Rogue with a special 2 for that power steal, so you can spam a lot of more specials. And then Beast, when awakened, barely takes any damage from suicides, and once you've dropped the double edge, you're actually healing off the poison. It's an absolutely great time and potentially worth a rank up if you really like the champion. I'm considering ranking mine up to rank 3. I'm just not quite there yet, as I have better options. And then finally, let me go over the honorable mentions. So the honorable mentions here, we have Nick Fury with the Deadpool synergies. When you have Nick Fury and Deadpool synergies, this means you can virtually run suicide masteries with anyone, because it will always get you a 20% heal at the start of every fight. 20%, I feel like I screwed that number up. Hold on, I need to fact check myself, and I'm definitely not restarting this video, so my apologies, team. 10%. So I have a note for 20% because that's the fall. Sorry. So at the start of every fight, you will get a 10% heal, and you will always convert double edge if that debuff is active, or you will convert poison if you don't have double edge active, like if you're running a bleed immune. And so it will always be essentially a 11.5% heal, or reduced by 30%, so like a 7.5% heal if you're affected by poison. But essentially this means you can run both suicides with any champion, and when you're running a champion that is half immune, say one of these poison champions or one of these bleed champions, I don't know why I don't, there we go, one of these champions or one of these champions over here, you're always going to get a heal, you're going to shrug the other debuff, and then you're essentially running a double immune champion, and it is a great time. Nick Fury Deadpool synergy absolutely changes the game. If you have Nick Fury and you have a Deadpool, I highly suggest you consider running suicides, because you might really like it. Next up, we have Sabretooth. Sabretooth gets a regeneration when struck as a defender. Mostly this guy is just worth ranking up because of the synergy he has with Omega Red. But again, touching on the Nick Fury Deadpool X-Force synergy, Deadpool synergy, Deadpool X-Force is one of the Deadpools, and so if you have a Deadpool and you have a Sabretooth, you might consider ranking up your Deadpool in the hopes of having him run with Nick Fury and Omega Red in the future, because that's what I did. But Sabretooth has a lot more value as a defender or an attacker just in general, so that option is there as well. Next up, I have to touch on Magic. Magic has full recoil mitigation, and Limbo does kind of mitigate a little bit of the suicide damage, but for the most part, Magic's on this list as an honorable mention because Limbo always activates when you use a special, and it lasts long enough to always mitigate the recoil. So the recoil damage procs and then instantly is regenerated back, and it's just, you got to be mindful of the fact that yes, it goes back, but you're still losing a lot of damage just from the suicides themselves, and Limbo can't mitigate that properly because you can't push that bar of power often enough to regenerate that health. But if you're trying to use Magic as a counter for 1 to 3 fights or so, where you're just spamming special 2, you can absolutely still get that value out of her. So that's a good time and worth knowing. Next up, we have Wolverine. His healing is relevant. It's just not good enough to sustain through the suicides. But that heal is strong enough that if you're really struggling, he can kind of like limp you through, or particularly if you're running like half suicides, like maybe you want to run only bleed, you could maybe get away with running Wolverine. Guillotine has a small chance to lifesteal once awakened. It's strong enough to, to heal up, but not strong enough to make her anywhere on this list, and still definitely less consistent than Wolverine. Angela also has a small regeneration. Pretty much everybody with a small regeneration should make this list, but they're not all on here because I'm lazy. Scarlet Witch I want to talk about because if the regeneration procs, it's a good time, but it's just so unwieldy that you can't really rely on it consistently. But a lot of people will probably wonder, hey, can Scarlet Witch's regeneration outpace suicides? And it can if you're lucky. But you can't count on that luck. It's just unwieldy. But hey, maybe you really need that extra champion, and she could be the one you put in. And then my final honorable mention here is Elsa Bloodstone. Elsa Bloodstone is better as a defender because currently she is triggering a degeneration on the opponents from suicides. This is quite a nuisance in Alliance War, especially if you put her on like those unknown nodes, because people might not be bringing double immune champions. They might be taking a degeneration, which is just absolutely frustrating. But do fact check this if you decide to go and use Elsa Bloodstone as a defender, as this is subject to change from Kabam. Champion is relatively new, so please be considerate, my friends. That said, that is all of everything. I have done everything I can to make this as succinct as possible. Feel free to comment or criticize, as long as you keep it polite, please, because I don't like rudeness. I don't handle rudeness well. To be honest, I do my best, but hey, remember that I'm a person too, and while I do take criticism, I would ask that you just keep it constructive and you keep it courteous. That said, hey, Suicide Mastery Champion tier list, best I can do. Check those tier lists out, and I'll talk to you guys later.